you very much. Thanks for inviting me to give this talk. It's, again, one of these nice things about the situation with COVID has been that we have been able to have these interactions across the world more easily, even though we very much miss traveling to different places and seeing people in person. So the talk I'm going to give today is something that I've worked on for a while. In some ways, it's a culmination of my first project on the Kola Peninsula in the far north and the environmental history of that region during the Soviet times as a way to sort of look at the Soviet experience more broadly from an environmental environmental history perspective. Some of what I'm going to talk about today is a bit more at the, well, I wouldn't say high theory level, I'd say medium theory level, but sort of higher theory level than sometimes historians work at. But I'm just going to sort of say that as a prefatory statement. I'm happy to sort of explain my thinking as I go through it. But if there's terms that are less familiar to anyone out there, please feel free to ask about them when we get to that point. Okay, so my main claim, the main sort of thesis for the presentation is that interactions with the material world presented an important, if sometimes underappreciated, element of the formation of Soviet subjectivity. It influenced everything from dedicated conservationists to people who just wanted to, industrialize nature, to people who really couldn't care either way. And it occurred in part through the engagement with the natural world, not just through engagement with environmentalism as a political project or political ideology. In many ways, this is a story of Soviet similarity with other parts of the modern world, but there are distinctive elements in the formation of Soviet environmental subjectivity, the sort of concept I want to put out there here. And that is, the distinctiveness could lie beyond what I'm about to say, but two particular elements I'm going to want to highlight are first, the simultaneous impulse to exploit and protect nature within individual consciousness as not having contradictions, but as being part of a similar process, and the way that the state's use of harsh natural conditions for punitive means, for punishment, affected individuals. These are two sort of distinctive elements of the type of environmental subjectivities within the Soviet Union. Now, the sort of the premise, part of my thinking about this came from noticing these two literatures in scholarship. One that dealt with environmental subjectivity and another that dealt with Soviet subjectivity. Both of these sort of schools of thought very much owed a lot in their thinking about subjectivity to the theories of Michel Foucault that really emphasized the way that discourses could shape the types of individual subjective experience and subjective understanding available for people in times. You could inhabit different subjective positions not based purely on psychology or your own will, but based on the larger political discursive world, cultural and discursive world that you inhabit. In the environmental case, the main sort of scholar to advance this idea was political scientist Arun Agarwal, who looked at a development in environmental understanding amongst peasants in a region in India, where over time they came to view themselves as sort of primary stewards of the forest after being very oppositional to British conservation measures in the early 20th century. And for Agarwal, this type of subjectivity, he writes about how people come to think and act in new ways in relation to the environmental domain, and for whom the environment constitutes a conceptual category that organizes some of their thinking. This theory from Agarwal is very much in its initial impulse and its initial formation tied to environmentalism and environmental consciousness what we call it, as we call it. But other scholars have looked at ways to sort of expand this to encompass not just environmentalism, not just the political project of protecting nature, but all sorts of other ways of that the way that the natural world intervenes on subjective experience and subjective identity. Along the same time, about the same time that this literature on environmental subjectivity emerged, Russian historians of the Soviet Union developed this idea about Soviet subjectivity. And in its initial formulation, it very much was focused on the sort of, more pronounced ways in which, communist ideology and Soviet totalitarianism could sort of impact individuals' feelings about themselves. So it was an active, the difference is this wasn't just sort of brainwashing, this was an active participation in the Stalinist project where, Communist Party members would have all of these autobiographical writings where they'd be trying to sort of align themselves with the Soviet collective. This, of course, has been nuanced by many other scholars since its initial formulation, to look at the various ways that Soviet subjectivity bore distinctions from liberal subjectivities, but also for similarities as well with other modern subjectivities. Most of this, again, comes from a sort of Foucauldian understanding of subjectivity. And none of these scholars were citing any of the scholarship on environmental subjectivity, just to put it out there. And that very simply. I think I sort of follow in some other recent, well, not follow, I go along with, because I was doing it, coming up with it independently, but go along with some other of the most recent scholarship on Soviet subjectivity who have looked in materialist directions, sort of have started to use not just Foucauldian analysis, but neo-materialist analysis to investigate subjectivity. And these are scholars like Colleen McQuinn and Alexei Golubov. And a neo-materialist understanding of subjectivity, again, this is different than Foucauldian discourse-based understanding of subjectivity, and it requires a bit of, just at least a little bit of elaboration here. I'm essentially saying that the physical world affects subjectivities in really important ways. What I'm not saying is that this occurs in a sort of environmental determinist way, that you simply have, a mountain range and that affects how people feel themselves as individuals because they're mountain people. That's a sort of very sort of problematic understanding of it. Instead, following scholars like Bruno Latour, I see the natural world and elements of the natural world, elements of the physical world interacting with humans, human agents in a sort of relational process. For Latour, who's developed actor network feelings, he talks about how in an actor network, there's a collection of mediators in which privilege is afforded neither to the willful agency of the individual nor the determining force of structures. An actor network is what is made to act in a large star-shaped web of mediators flowing in and out of it, meaning that it is an unstable assemblage of connected elements within the material world. From this perspective, subjectivity becomes more visible when scholars consider the engagement with the natural world. As Latour writes, subjectivity is not the property of human souls, but the gathering itself, the process of making an individual which is constantly in flux is what's going on with the creation of subjectivity. And that invites us to consider how the natural world is contributing to this process, okay? Now, there's a few things to sort of point out here. That's sort of my theoretical framing, but there's a few things to point out as well before I get to the sort of meat of my examples. One, of course, is to repeat the thing I started with, is that the type of environmental subjectivity I'm interested in exploring is not simply about environmentalism. It's about the totality of interactions with the natural world in the way that I believe that they affected Soviet understandings and Soviet experiences of the self. And it's also that while environmental subjectivities are something that can see throughout the modern world at least, and I think it's open for debate whether this concept could be applied back to earlier time periods as well, there are these two sort of really distinctive elements of subjectivity in the Soviet Union. One is the sort of really pronounced insistence among some people who occupy environmental subjectivities that there's not a conflict between conservation, nature protection, and industrial exploitation. That these are things that can be resolved through totalistic, holistic sort of approach. And the other is the ways that the punitive use of the natural world, especially in the Stalinist period, could shape individual selfhood. And that's something, I mean, it's not, you see this in other places, but there's something very particular about the Soviet project that does that. I want to be clear, I'm saying distinctive, not unique intentionally, because it's always easy to point out similarities between other places in the world and the Soviet Union, but I still think these are distinctive things. Now, in order to flesh out my thinking here, I'm going to turn to sort of biographical vignettes of three different individuals. All of them are people who spent time in the region I wrote my first book about, the Kola Peninsula. All of them lived sort of quintessentially Soviet lives. They kind of came of age with the Soviet project and died near the end of it in the 80s or even into the 2000s. They all, beyond those similarities though, they're going to do different things. The first one, Oleg Semenov-Tian-Shanskii, sort of demonstrates a more classic example of an environmentalist subjectivity that emerges in the Soviet Union and shows how some of the institutions that existed in the Soviet period helped give rise to a type of environmental consciousness. My second example, Leonid Potemkin, speaks to something else, which is the way, because he's, I'm going to talk a lot about him, but he's, not someone we would consider an environmentalist today. In some ways, is very much a loud champion of the conquest of the North and the conquest of nature. But I want to emphasize that the way that he grapples with the natural world and the way that he comes up to his own sort of distinctive environmental thinking helps demonstrate that environmental subjectivity exists not only for people who become sort of environmentalists or quasi-environmentalists, but for people who kind of are on the opposite side of that debate, that way of thinking. And then the third case, Inna Tartakovskaia, gives an example of a person for whom neither of these sort of pro-environmentalist, anti-environmentalist sides of the debate mattered much. But still, we can see in her case the ways that the material and natural world very much affected her understandings of herself, her subjective experience. And with her case, taken with the other two cases, I'll leave you all with a suggestive argument that this phenomenon of environmental subjectivity is broader than these three cases. I obviously can't prove it with an N of 3, but I can sort of make a suggestive case based on these three cases that show different sides of the phenomena. Okay. Now, first turning to Oleg Semenov-Tian-Shanskii. He was born to an aristocratic scientific family of the late imperial period. His grandfather was geographer and statistician Pyotr Semyonov, who had the Tian-Shanskii appended to his name by Tsar Nicholas II in October 1906. This family sat out the Russian Revolution in their estate in Tambov, where young Oleg spent his time immersed with the natural world, started keeping a diary of his observations of the world around him, the species, the flowers that grew, all of this while some of his uncles were involved in starting to create the Zapovednik, the nature reserve system, in the late imperial, or at the very end of the Tsarist and early Soviet period. I would also argue, though, that his diaries and the prominent role that observations of natural conditions that played in his writing of his diary wasn't just sort of the side material that doesn't really matter once he's going to start talking about his deep inner life. These were actually ways of helping forge an inner life, as well as engaging with the outside surrounding worlds. Now, that all said, that might imply that Semenov-Tian-Shanskii was essentially on an environmentalist path from non-Soviet influences. And I think that, well, I mean, how I just said it is probably fair. He had a family background and a pre-Soviet experience that inclined him towards a love of nature and environmental protection. But it was the particular institutions that he encounters with as he emerges in the 1920s into adulthood that really ended up shaping his environmental experiences and environmentalism. In particular, he moves up to the Kola Peninsula and initially works at a nature reserve, or soon was working at a nature reserve, the Lapland Nature Reserve, that is created in 1930. He talks immediately about how this is very much to his liking and how he enjoys the sort of idea of purposeful conservation work. This nature reserve is set up in order by his colleague German Krebs in order to rehabilitate and preserve a population of wild reindeer or caribou that existed in this western part of the Kola Peninsula. It's actually a very successful endeavor. Unlike the Nordic countries, the Kola Peninsula still has wild reindeer to this day, whereas most all the reindeer in Nordic countries have been domesticated. As this begins, he pretty immediately has an opportunity to sort of develop his environmental consciousness, his environmental awareness, his environmental feelings even deeper. When can you see my cursor? No, you can't see my cursor. Or can you see my cursor? Someone? Yes, okay. So here's the nature reserve. And then right here is where the Montchegorsk, which is a nickel smelting facility, gets placed. And by the early 1930s, before the city is built, before it's established, the people, Oleg Semenov-Tian-Shanskii gets wind of this information and becomes alarmed and starts to worry that the entire nature reserve will be ruined by the exploitation of one of its essential parts of the territory and will soon bring about the disappearance of the animal of wild reindeer. They're able to prevent this partially by changing the borders of the nature reserve, partially by fending off, or not fending off, but because of delays of the construction of the Sabre nickel plant for a few years. Indeed, then Semenov-Tian-Shanskii spends much of the 1930s engaged in work at the Lapland Nature Reserve, studying animals, studying avian life. His future spouse, Maria Vladimirskaya, works with him on avian life and bird studies. And then even during the war, he's posted in Karelia, where he continues his studies of wildlife. And as one scholar who wrote a biographical account of him wrote, even in war, he was still a naturalist. From then on, Semenov-Tian-Shanskii's environmental subjectivity related to his concern over poaching and improper hunting of animals from the period of the war. So what happens during the war is that there's a lot of unsanctioned hunting of both the reindeer population and other species on the territory of the nature reserve. And this sort of enrages Semenov-Tian-Shanskii, who decries this as barbarism and is quite unsympathetic towards the material needs of the population who during the war, saying, well, at some point it was simply about, there was a necessity for food, but then people started selling some of the animals that they were had hunted, and that this was turned into this rapacious moment. He, in contrasting himself with others, yes, okay, sorry. The environmental advocacy at this point then also turns against the indigenous peoples of the Kola Peninsula, where in the 1950s, the Lapland Nature Reserve, which late 50s and early 60s, the Lapland Nature Reserve, which is under Semenov-Tian-Shanskii, pushes for, or supports a consolidation of a collective farm, the Red Hulozura collective farm, which was mostly a Sami collective farm just north of the nature reserve. This eventually becomes an experimental reindeer breeding station, and is kept, and through that process gets isolated from the reindeer population on the Lapland Nature Reserve. And this is, for Semenov-Tian-Shanskii, this is a moment where a lot of his feelings about what proper security over nature reserves, what proper behavior of individuals towards other species should be, gets expressed as a sort of vehement denunciation of irrational hunting and taking in a sort of personal value for protecting the natural world around him. A change occurs, though, in his own sort of environmentalism and environmental subjectivity with the continued rise of industry. So in about the starting in the late 1960s and 1970s, the Monchegorsk, the Saber Nickel Combine in Monchegorsk begins to pollute, or the pollution from that factory becomes so pronounced it starts destroying territory of the nature reserve, of the Lapland Nature Reserve. And at this point, Semenov-Tian-Shanskii spares spares nothing in denouncing it, even getting an article published in Pravda denouncing the sort of smoke that hangs over the Lapland Nature Reserve. And as he's doing this, it actually ends up being somewhat effective for the nature reserve, in that the borders of the nature reserve are again adjusted to include territory that is beyond what and in the opposite direction of where the natural world is being despoiled. This deep attachment to Lapland nature and its role in forging an environmentalist self remained with him until his very end. He has himself buried on the territory of the nature reserve when he passes away. And so to wrap up with Semenov-Tian-Shanskii, what I think is important is that his biography shows how the Soviet Union offered paths towards an individual embrace of a very sort of classical environmentalism, an environmentalism that's about, protection from overhunting, and is about stopping industrial pollution. That another way to put that is that the scientific and technological obsessions can be manifest in sort of a hermetic, staying away from everyone else, dealing with nature protection, as opposed to these sort of other front lines. And I would just also add that the form and the ways that his environmental concerns, the specific issues that come up for him, are very much shaped by the discrete interactions with landscapes. That it's not just an application of sort of environmental principles writ large, but engagement with avian life, engagement with reindeer, engagement with industrial pollution that shape what parts of his subjectivity are influenced by the environment. Okay, now to get to my second example. Again, this is a communist geologist named Leonid Potemkin, who's a very different background than Semenov-Tian-Shanskii. He comes from a family that was impoverished during the Russian Revolution and Civil War, and he calls at one point being reduced to stealing flour from neighbors in order to be able to survive. Whereas Semenov-Tian-Shanskii was sort of living off in the aristocratic estate before it was taken over by authorities. The two contemporaries also had a very different idea about technology and industry in the world. Semenov-Tian-Shanskii was in many ways an environmental purist, whereas Potemkin was a staunch optimist about technological solutions to environmental issues. Yet despite this, their different lives, values, and opinions, Potemkin also found a self influenced by engagement with the natural world. Now, Potemkin, for certain audiences, it might be a fairly familiar figure because while he's a less obvious case of an environmentalist or an environmental thinker, he might be the closest thing to the physical embodiment of the new Soviet man. He's a prominent figure in Johann Helbeck's book about diary writing in the Soviet Union, where Helbeck writes that for Potemkin, the development of his personality was the main central theme of the age. For Potemkin, the development of his personality was a central theme of the age, and accordingly also his personal development. More deliberately than other diarists, he situated his record of personal life within a revolutionary narrative of the merging socialist personality. He very much sort of viewed the process of working on himself in order to align his own personality with the Soviet project and the ideological imperatives of Soviet socialism as a predominant place. So, I would say that he makes him a good figure to investigate this question of environmental subjectivity with, and he's also a sort of prominent figure in the literature. Now, Potemkin's was born in 1914. He, again, had an impoverished childhood. And it becomes committed to the communist cause from an early age. He joins the Komsomol in 1934 and writes about himself as possessing quote, an inclination towards engineering of men's souls and dreaming about the ideal of my personality. We need to create ever more, ever better for mankind. In this we find the self-satisfaction of the personality and the eternal limitlessness of the blooming of life, like the eternal flow of matter. And now matter mattered for Potemkin. His diary entries and his ongoing interpretation of dialectical materialism really sort of leads him to emphasize a rootedness of his personality and his individual well-being or individual being within material and social circumstances surrounding him. He also was very inclined to sort of bring in metaphors of vitalistic metaphors of the physical world affecting selfhood, writing about how workers in the Soviet Union in the 1930s were like graphite being turned into crystal through the process of state transformation. He also willfully embraced a difficult path of attaining a socialist selfhood, in part through physical work himself. He comes to believe that that he needs to get himself into shape, engage in physical fitness, do the labor of mining, go down into mining, go down into places where mining work is happening, and he's working as a geological prospector, and deal with the sort of physical circumstance of this, that this can harden him and that this can sort of turn him into an ideal Soviet man. Now, this process is not seamless. As Lilia Kaganovsky, literary scholar Lilia Kaganovsky has informed us, the new Soviet man was often a damaged masculinity as much as it was a sort of voluntaristic, willful embrace of heightened human potential. That oftentimes within even in literary depictions, the process of developing a Soviet masculinity was one fraught with incompletion and limitation. And Potemkin very much sort of embodies this. He has a nervous breakdown in the middle of the 1930s, and only slowly kind of digs himself out of this sort of fit of depression to develop a sort of new sort of bombastic, the sort of being a bombastic optimist about the Soviet project actually took a mental toll on him, even though he continues to embrace it very, very stridently. A place that he ends up finding sort of solace is, and a deep part of what he feels is his achievement in this comes from his work during the war as a geological prospector in the Pechinga region on the Kola Peninsula. This is another nickel region where he helps discover new nickel deposits as the Soviet Union takes over this territory and from Norway after the war, from Finland after the war, and it becomes part of the Soviet Union in the post-war period. He writes about how this project of overcoming the difficulties was a deeply fulfilling thing for him as a communist, and how the difficulties of work in a polar region allowed the natural resources of Pechinga and the enormous scale of the Soviet economy to enable rapid economic development in the region and help flourish personalities, including his and others. This sort of work industrializing nature is something that gives fulfillment to his own personality and individuality. And I'm arguing in part that this sort of process of industrial assimilation is in itself a different type of environmental subjectivity. Now, it gets actually really interesting here because Potemkin not only, after this period in his career, rises to become a deputy minister of geology for the Russian Republic of the Soviet Union. He also becomes an active member of the All-Russian Society for the Protection of Nature. So while he's sort of praising the conquest of the Pechinga region in the north, he's also being involved in the largest Soviet environmental organization. Now, as Douglas Wiener has talked about, this organization becomes much less cutthroat and much less oppositional to the Soviet state by the 1960s and 1970s, when many Communist Party members sort of fill its ranks. And Potemkin's clearly one of these Communist Party members that fills the ranks of the All-Russian Society for the Protection of Nature. But I would say that we need to still take his environmental thinking very seriously and look at what he's actually saying and actually thinking. And in his case, it's very clear. He writes 3 different books in the 60s and 70s, and the evolution of his thinking is very transparent here. He goes from writing a book about the industrial development of the Pechinga region to a book about Lenin and his sort of thinking about the natural world, to this final book up here about mining techniques, and the protection of the natural world. And as he's doing this, as he's in this process, one thing that's very clear is that, and I know this from reading his diary from the 1970s, he's going out for walks in the forest, he's visiting nature reserves, and his impressions of these, of seeing these places is coming back and influencing some of his thinking about the natural world. Now, in this 1977 book about the protection of the subsurface and the natural environment, he takes what's in many ways a sort of technical manual and turns it into a philosophical meditation about that really sort of puts out his own dialectical understanding of the natural world and its relationship between conservation and exploitation. For him, there's no antagonistic contradictions between the rational exploitation of industry and the protection of the environment. Indeed, he believes that communist society is able to ensure the genuine harmony of the technological progress in nature and the optimal combination of the development of the mining industry with the tasks of improving the environment. Here is, in his mind, the key distinction between communism and capitalism is that communism can do this, and that communist individuals can come to see the world in this way that allows for this capacity and this ability to do so. He has no place for the sort of bourgeois defense of wild nature as a good in of itself, but is very interested in seeing how and developing process and talking about how humans can come to improve the natural world beyond them in a way that allows other life to flourish as well as human life. He even gives an early warning about the problem of global warming in the 1980s and saying that this is a planetary problem that requires urgent and coordinated action. So dismissing this guy as purely a, destroy all nature type of person, I think would miss what some of the interesting things going on with his thinking. So to wrap up with Potemkin, and I guess one other thing to say on his biography is that he remains committed to the Soviet project to his dying day, and sort of reads what happens in the 1990s as sort of validation of his perspective from the 1970s and the 1930s even. But what his case helps show is that were environmental subjectivities available to and present that entailed holding a very anthropocentric, a very human-centered, but consistently relational orientation towards the natural world. And even sort of party line people could develop these environmental subjectivities. And for people like him, they're very much willing and interested in making environmental concern be seen as a Soviet value, embracing it. I mean, we can talk about the limitations of this in terms of environmental outcomes, but I think it's important to take it seriously that the impulse to embrace environmental protection as, or a sort of specific version of environmental protection as a Soviet value. And this is to show that, environmental subjectivities were not only something that you had some Zapovednik scientists who were environmentalists proposing, but something that was sort of more broadly shared amongst other segments of society as well. Okay, now my third case. So Inna Tartakovskaia was born in Odessa in 1907 to a Jewish family. And she comes to demonstrate a very different sort of trajectory, one that's less concerned with these questions about, environmental protection and somewhat at a remove from it, but also one where landscape and physical features of the material world deeply impact her, both through her experience as becoming a sort of pioneer of developing the North and through her carceral experiences of oppression in the Gulag. After she comes from Odessa, she moves to Leningrad in the 1920s, hoping to become a ballerina. She had started to train as a ballerina. And then her husband, Vasily Kondratyov, gets sent up to develop the Khabini Mountains in the Kola Peninsula. And Sergei Kirov, the Leningrad party boss, essentially tells Tartakovskaia to retrain as a technical specialist, give up her dreams of ballet, and instead start working on chemical processing and becoming an engineer who can help work for the project of Stalinist industrialization. And this is essentially what she does. She immediately switches from sort of focusing on perfecting the movements of her body to working with chemicals and other agents in laboratory settings. And this sort of, in her own reflections, these moments of retraining, these moments of engagement with laboratory equipment is also sort of affecting her selfhood too. She's talking about how these experiences really start making her think differently, as do her visits to the Kola Peninsula during the industrial period. She's overtaken by the sort of beauty of the natural surroundings there, while also very interested in the ways that the project of the Soviets to industrialize this place is allowing for a sort of holistic flourishing of new human potential in formerly difficult and forbidding places. This is a duality that she shares with Potemkin, and is one that I think is, and I've argued elsewhere, is quite common amongst Soviet citizens at different points in time. Now, her life changes quite dramatically in the mid-1930s. She goes up and lives permanently in the Khabini Mountains starting in 1935, but then 1937 comes around, and unsurprisingly, her husband, who's a Communist Party member and leading several enterprises on the Kola Peninsula at this time, is arrested as an enemy of the people, sent to Leningrad and shot, unbeknownst to her, several months later, whereas she is also arrested and deported to Gulag camps, where she spends about a decade. First near Tomsk, then over in the Kolyma camps. She later leaves us recollections of this, where she recalls the sort of the visceral, physical ways that Soviet oppression sort of affected her feelings and understandings of self. She talks about how being the humiliating experience of being held in captivity, the smell of the rotting cabbage, the cold, the feces and urine in the prison cells, these types of things that are very visceral and very much stick with her. While she's in the Kolyma camps, she sort of also has leaves some recollections of her time there that sort of echoes a sentiment that Varlam Shalamov, who overlapped with her, writer Varlam Shalamov, who overlapped with her there, expressed, which is, nature in the North is not apathetic or indifferent, it is in pact with those who sent us here. The sort of idea that the harsh conditions in the Far East were aiding the Soviet project of punishment and rehabilitation for people who had been labeled enemies of the state, enemies of the people. And this, these material deprivations, I think, speak to, there's lots of things that end up happening with Tartakovskaia's experience here. And I need to, let me go to talk about some things from other experiences to go back to Tartakovskaia. So historian Alexis Perry has recently written about the blockade of Leningrad and the ways that material deprivations during the blockade could have this degendering effect, where sexual difference and distinctiveness sort of evaporated for several of the diary writers that she looked at, who felt that they had become sort of less capable of understanding themselves in gender terms. Where another scholar, though, Anna Muller, has looked at communist prison camps in Poland and kind of come to the opposite sort of take, where these sort of spaces of confinement actually promoted a type of gendered accentuation, where women in these camps sort of try to heighten their sort of femininity in order to, in part as a coping mechanism for the experience that they were dealing with. In Tartakovska's place, I see sort of experience. I see both of these dynamics of sort of degendering and gendered accentuation. While she's in the Kolyma camp, she actually rejoins her earlier pursuit, or she repursues her earlier pursuit in ballet. She becomes a ballerina again and dances in a prison troupe as a prisoner during her time in the Gulag. She also, though, suffers from frostbite on her legs, which leads to them being amputated later on. And this, of course, sort of, you know, the idea of a ballerina who then has to suffer from amputation and sort of deprived of this gendered expression of herself it sort of speaks more to what Perry was talking about. After she leaves the camps, she stays in Magadan. She's forced to stay in Magadan for another decade, but then does return to the Hibini Mountains in the 1960s. And there she's sort of overtaken with this idea that this was still her life's accomplishment. Despite all the hardship she faced in the interim, she just waxes lyrical about the ways that the bringing to life of northern nature under the Soviet auspices has really sort of still given her life meaning. And she, you know, at one point asks for, writes to an artist to ask for a landscape drawing of the Hibini Mountains, saying that all my life has been, since youth, has been attached to this place, happily or unhappily. I'm realizing I forgot to go through the slides, but this is just quickly. This is a sketch that we have of Tartakovskaia while imprisoned in Tomsk. That memorial has managed to be able to, foundations managed to bring us down to today, and one from the night later, from after her release. So Tartakovskaia's case and her life shows the prevalence of the material environment in the formation of subjectivities for individuals who didn't seek out ecological relations, but were instead sort of forced into the potent entanglements with the natural world by Soviet authorities. And that this, you know, very much, you know, there are plenty of other people in the Soviet Union who faced state oppression or compulsory migration, who then had their own subjectivities faced by shaped by environmental engagements. In her case, I think then helps us suggest that that sort of environmental subjectivity existed beyond these questions of environmental debates, that this is a phenomenon that we can see, if we're thinking about it, the totality of relationships with the natural world. This is a phenomenon we can see outside of, beyond environmentalism. Environmentalism is part of it, but it goes well beyond that. Okay, now to wrap up, I think it's important that we understand, to go back to the point that an earlier point, that I don't want my emphasis on distinctiveness to overshadow, which is that Soviet environmental subjectivity is a concept that actually helps us mostly put the Soviet Union in comparative conversation with other modernizing states. Environmental subjectivities sort of arise in many places in the modern world, maybe even exist beyond that, and that the Soviet project and that the Soviet experience of seeing the rise of environmental subjectivities really fits in that. Someone like Semenov-Tian-Shanskii is very much, you know, his trajectory is to go from an environmentalist akin to John Muir to an environmentalist akin to Rachel Carson. Someone like Potemkin sort of, you know, mirrors some of the sort of engineering environmentalists, good growth wise growth environmentalists that you might see in other countries. Tartakovskaia very much speaks to many people who've had environmental interactions without really caring one way or another about environmental protection. That said, I do think there are these. I do think what my argument here is helping us see is that the ways that interaction with the natural world affected subjectivities in materially as well as intellectually and discursively gives the concept of environmental subjectivity sort of a broader reach and allows it to help us understand the sort of the character of subjective experience beyond discourse, beyond sort of the ways that much of the scholarly literature has really talked about that. Finally, then, I would want to sort of make the plug that I think the new types of ways about thinking about the material world sort of presented by new materialism, where we see non-human nature as a sort of active participant within human stories and unexpected places. This is a sort of, I think that the argument I've been putting out here today helps us open up questions beyond subjectivity, helps us open up questions to think about the environmental dimensions of many other topics that we might not, historically view as having an environmental connection. Thank you all. And of course, I'd like to acknowledge the grant that's helped funding, current affiliation with Tübingen State University, the Imaginary Anthropocene project funded by the Russian Science Foundation. And if you want to know more, the subject of this talk, I've already published my main sort of thinking about in an article in Slavic Review. So thank you. I think we still have plenty of time for questions. So.